Given a chained alien slave as a reward, he untied her shackles and called her his wife. The summons came just as the frost storm broke, timed too perfectly to be a coincidence. Davin Trenz stood by the warped glass panel of his shelter, watching the last shards of ice melt against the polymer. He hadn't stepped outside in 2 days, not because of the cold, he'd endured worse, but because quiet gave him time to think, and thinking lately had become dangerous. Then the alert pinged, a sharp, sterile tone. Audit findings confirmed. Immediate attendance required. Overseer Van, Sector Core, no details, no signature. But he felt it, the tension threading through every clipped word. This wasn't a debrief, it was a message. And Davin, despite everything, still understood threats when they came dressed as invitations. He pulled on his coat, fingers stiff from disuse, and stepped into the cold. The colony was carved into the bones of a hostile world, a terraforming attempt that had stalled decades ago. Officially, the planet was designated Raisa 7. Unofficially, the colonists called it Gray Line for the endless slate-colored horizon that never changed, no matter the sun's position. Temperatures rarely rose above freezing, even during the so-called thaw seasons. The wind carried fine crystal dust that chewed through gear, skin, and patience. The lift at the perimeter checkpoint groaned as it descended, a single blinking panel illuminating the shaft in pale green. Davin adjusted his collar, jaw set. His boots scraped the rusted floor plating. The sound was hollow, like the inside of a forgotten tomb. There had been another girl once, bright-eyed, defiant. She'd filed a complaint. They reassigned her the next day. Davin had checked every report after that. Her name never appeared again. He'd learned to stop asking. The elevator opened into the administrative level, if you could call it that. A corridor lined with dented metal walls and flickering lights leading to what passed for authority in this place. The guards outside Van's office didn't speak. One coughed into a gloved fist. The other stared at him like a man watching ice melt, too slow to matter. Inside, Overseer Van was already smiling. "Mr. Trenz," he said, arms spread as if greeting a guest. "I've read your latest audit. Very thorough, very enlightening." Davin said nothing. He stepped forward and waited. "You've uncovered a real knot in our supply chain. Misrouted shipments, falsified work orders, costs adding up in the wrong hands. A mess, really. One that could have embarrassed this colony. But lucky us." Van steepled his fingers. "You fixed it." "I reported the truth," Davin replied quietly. Van leaned back, the synthetic leather of his chair groaning beneath him. "And for that, you deserve a reward." The door behind Davin opened. 2 guards entered, leading someone between them. She looked like she'd been carved from a different story. Alien, yes, but not unfamiliar. Her skin was a deep, quiet green, the color of moss after rain. Long black hair hung in unkempt ropes down her back, tangled and uneven where it had been hacked short and allowed to regrow. She wore a thin shift that clung to her shoulders like frost. Her wrists were locked in binding cuffs, heavy, rust-pitted, designed more for display than security. Her eyes stayed low, but she wasn't broken. Still, stillness was a shield. "She's yours," Van said, gesturing with casual cruelty. "Clean, obedient, not yet tagged, so you're free to register her however you prefer. Companionship is important for morale, especially out on the edge." Davin didn't speak. He couldn't. Something twisted in his gut, something old and familiar. She felt their eyes more than the cold. Each glance was a scalpel, carving her down to what they wanted her to be. But behind her stillness, she counted. Steps, breaths, exits. She noted how the tall one, the one who hadn't spoken, kept his distance. How his eyes didn't roam. That mattered. More than his words ever would. No. It escaped Davin before he could stop it. Van raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? I don't need this. Return her to intake." "And flag your audit for review?" Van's voice didn't rise. He didn't have to. "We'd hate to discover an error in your calculations, Trenz. A fabricated discrepancy, falsified charges. That sort of thing tends to spread." Davin felt the chill behind the words. The message was clear. Accept the gift or accept the consequences. He looked at the woman again. She hadn't flinched, hadn't spoken. Her eyes were still on the floor, but he saw now that they were open. Watching, he forced his voice steady. "I'll take her." "Excellent choice," Van said. "Dismissed." The walk back to his shelter took 15 minutes through dust-laced air and slush-veiled ground. The path curved between fungal fields and abandoned dig lines, where machines sat like rusting beasts, frozen in the act of decay. She followed him in silence, bare feet leaving prints that disappeared within seconds. He didn't offer his coat. She wouldn't have taken it. That he was sure of. His shelter sat at the edge of the colony, a cramped prefab built before he arrived, repaired with his own hands, re-insulated 3 times. Inside, it smelled of old metal and dried broth. 2 rooms, 1 heater, 1 narrow bed. Enough space for a quiet man with no need for comfort. He let her enter first, then closed the door behind them. There were no words. He moved to the back wall, pulled open a crate, and retrieved a small toolkit. Approached her slowly. She tensed. Her eyes flicked up just for a second. He saw the depth there. Fear, yes, but something else. Appraisal. He knelt, placed the tools beside her, and began unlocking her cuffs. The first click made her twitch. The second made her brace. On the third, he paused. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't respond, but her shoulders relaxed. Barely. Enough. When the final shackle fell, David stood and stepped back. "There's food," he said, gesturing to the stove. "It's warm. Water's clean. You can sleep there." He nodded toward the cot. Then he picked up his bedroll and stepped outside. It was dark now. The storm had passed, but the cold lingered, seeping into every seam. He lay down under the tarp stretched between his shelter and the generator shed, wrapped the roll around himself, and closed his eyes. He didn't sleep. Inside, she stayed standing for a long time. The cuffs were gone, but the weight of them still lingered. Her arms bore faint scars, pale against green skin, patterned like old rivers dried by time. She walked to the stove, touched the pot. The heat startled her, sharp and sudden. She lifted the ladle with 2 fingers and poured broth into a metal cup. It smelled strange, rich, salty. She sat down and drank fast, too fast, coughed, eyes stung. She held the cup tighter and drank again. Later, when the shelter grew colder and the heater ticked, she saw his shape through the frosted panel, curled under a tarp. Still. She took the blanket from the cot, wrapped it around her shoulders, then opened the door just enough to slip through. The cold hit like a slap, but she moved quickly, laid the blanket over him without a word. He didn't move, but as she stepped back, his hand shifted, closing gently around the edge of the fabric. She watched him for a moment longer, then turned and walked back into the silence of the shelter. It was not safety, not yet, but it was not what she'd expected, and that for now was enough. David woke before the sky lightened, as he always did. But this morning, something was different. The blanket she'd laid over him hadn't slipped. It was tucked, deliberately. The tarp above him glistened with frost, but the cold hadn't reached his chest where the fabric held. She'd come outside, in the dark, while he slept. He didn't move right away, just stared at the pale gray fabric inches from his face, trying to untangle what it meant. Not obedience, not gratitude. It was an action, a choice, one he hadn't asked for. When the cold crept into his bones, he stirred, shook off the stiffness, and stood. His limbs ached from the frozen ground. Inside the shelter, the heater had long since faded to its low cycle, barely enough to keep the air above freezing. But it was still warmer than the night air. He pushed the door open, stepped into the silence, and met her eyes. She was awake, seated cross-legged on the floor near the stove, her back to the warm wall. She didn't startle, didn't shrink, just looked at him with that same watchful calm she'd held since the moment he first saw her. The blanket was folded neatly at her side. The air between them held no words, but it didn't need to, not yet. He moved to the stove, cranked the starter until it hissed to life, then set a pot of water to boil. She didn't follow his movements, but she was alert. He felt it more than saw it, how her breath paused as he bent near the flame, how her shoulders tensed at the sound of boiling, not fear, anticipation. When he turned with 2 metal cups, she accepted one without hesitation, sipped the broth slowly. No trembling this time, just silence. "I'm going to the fields," he said quietly. "I'll be back before midday." He didn't wait for a response. Slid on his coat, laced his boots, and stepped back into the wind. The walk to the fungal domes was short but steep. Icy patches made the incline treacherous, and the path cut through jagged outcroppings of rusted pipe and abandoned machinery. The domes rose like tumors from the earth, their surfaces veined with mineral streaks. Spray nozzles pulsed every few seconds, misting the air with recycled nutrient sludge. The smell was metallic and faintly sweet. He checked the valve lines, cleared sediment from 2 intake vents, and realigned a miscalibrated pressure gauge. Normally, he'd let his thoughts drift, count pulses, monitor pH levels. Today, his mind stayed anchored to the shelter. She hadn't run. She hadn't curled back into the farthest corner or stared blankly through him. She had eaten, folded the blanket, even looked him in the eye. He didn't know her name. That was still a missing piece, and he refused to guess. But she was present. There was power in that. By the time he returned, the sky had faded to a dull silver. The shelter was still. Inside, the stove's glow painted her skin in faint orange tones. She was sitting near the cot this time, legs tucked neatly beneath her. Her hair was damp, wet, he realized, with cleaned water. The basin near the door was empty, the cloth draped to dry. She had bathed, not because he told her to, because she chose to. He placed his tools by the door, unwound his scarf, and crouched by the stove. Pulled strips of dried fungus rat meat from the storage bin and laid them over the heat plate. They sizzled quickly, curling at the edges. "You're welcome to use the cot," he said without turning around. "I'll stay by the door." Still no answer, but she didn't move away either. He plated 2 equal portions and handed one to her. She took it, ate slowly this time, deliberately. The silence between them had shifted. It wasn't heavy anymore, just quiet. "I'll go to salvage tomorrow," he said after they ate. "You need boots, warmer clothes, maybe a knife if they don't ask questions." She looked at him, then at her hands. The scars across her wrists caught the firelight, thin white lines crisscrossing green skin. Not fresh, but not old enough to fade. He wondered if she'd ever had her own knife before, if she'd ever been trusted with one. After cleaning the plates, he poured another pot of water and set it beside her with a clean cloth. She took it wordlessly and turned her back. He stepped outside again, not out of necessity, but respect. The wind had died. Only a low, constant hiss of vapor from the distant domes filled the silence. David sat on the edge of the crate, hands in his lap. He didn't know how long he stayed there, staring at nothing, letting the chill bite through his coat. It wasn't guilt he felt, not entirely. It was heavier, older. The sense that every good thing he touched either broke or vanished. There had been a girl once, bright and defiant. She filed a report after a supervisor crossed a line. David supported her. 3 days later, she disappeared from records, reassigned off-planet without warning. No forwarding contact, no trail. He never found out what happened to her. Maybe he hadn't tried hard enough. Maybe that's why he'd stepped forward in Van's office when he shouldn't have. Not out of courage. Just shame that had finally grown claws. When he re-entered the shelter, she was seated by the stove again, clean now, wrapped in the same thermal blanket she'd given him the night before. Her gaze followed him as he laid out his bedroll across the doorway. Not as a barrier, just placement, a gesture. He didn't speak, neither did she. But as he lay back and closed his eyes, her voice came, barely audible, dry, rough from disuse. One word. "Why?" He opened his eyes, met hers. "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but I didn't want them to have you." She studied him for a long moment. Then slowly she leaned her head against the wall behind her and let her eyes close. That night, sleep came in pieces, short, broken spans of half-conscious rest. But they were enough. And for the first time in years, Dave and Trends didn't dream of screaming silence or empty corridors. He dreamed of warmth, not fire, not flesh, just presence. And when morning came, she was still there. The mornings came quietly on Greyline. There was no sun to break through the sky, just a slow lifting of darkness into a haze the color of rusted steel. The shelter's interior shifted from deep shadow to dim gray, the only warmth radiating from the stove's low flame. David woke to the scent of heat moss boiling in the corner pot, mild, earthy, a bit sour. For a moment he didn't move. Something felt different. He turned his head and saw her. She was crouched by the stove, stirring the pot with careful, practiced movements. Her long black hair, still slightly damp, framed her face in uneven strands. She wore the same thermal blanket draped over her shoulders, but it no longer looked like armor. It looked like clothing, like choice. Her eyes flicked to his, brief, assessing, then back to the stew. No words passed between them, but something had shifted in the silence. He sat up slowly, stretching stiff muscles beneath his shirt. The air inside was warmer than it had been for days, not just from the stove, from the sense that, for the first time since she arrived, they were sharing the space. "Smells better than when I cook it," he said softly, voice still rough from sleep. She didn't answer, but her stirring slowed, and the corner of her mouth twitched. Not a smile, not yet, but close. They ate in silence, seated a few feet apart, knees almost touching. She didn't flinch when he handed her the bowl, didn't drop her gaze. Afterward, he cleaned the dishes while she sat watching the vapor rise through the vent pipe. Her posture was relaxed, not completely, but enough that her shoulders no longer touched her ears. "You spoke last night," he said gently, not turning around. "You asked why." She didn't reply, but when he set the bowl aside and sat across from her, she met his eyes. No fear, just caution, familiar, controlled. "I still don't have a better answer," he admitted. "I saw what they were doing and I didn't want to be part of it." A pause, then softly, "You were." Her voice was low, deeper than he expected. Rough, but not broken. He swallowed. "Yeah, I was." She watched him carefully as though weighing his reaction. "Why didn't you leave me there?" she asked. No anger, just a question, like testing the edges of something sharp. "I thought about it," he said honestly, "but I couldn't walk away." "That doesn't make you good." "No," he said, "it doesn't." That answer seemed to settle something between them. She leaned back slightly as if a decision had been made. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers twined together, no longer curled into fists. "My name is Lyria." The sound of it hit harder than he expected. A name, offered freely. He nodded. "I'm Davin." "I know," she said. "They said it when they gave me to you." Something twisted in his chest. "I didn't want that," he said. "You being a reward." "I know," she replied, voice steady. Outside, wind scraped across the metal panels, rattling the bolts on the south-facing wall. Inside, the warmth remained intact. He stood, moved to the crate near the door, and pulled out a wrapped bundle. "I found these this morning," he said, unrolling it on the floor. A thick wool tunic, salvaged pants with thermal lining, and a pair of insulated boots, worn but intact. She looked at them, then at him. "You went to salvage?" He nodded. "Traded some tools I don't use anymore." She reached for the boots first, turned them in her hands. They were too big, but her expression didn't change. "Thank you," she said. Davin looked away, giving her space as she dressed. When he turned back, she was lacing the boots, the sleeves of the tunic rolled back at the wrists. He'd imagined she'd look fragile in clothing that didn't fit, like someone playing dress-up in another life. But instead, she looked grounded, like she belonged in the world again, not hovering at the edge of it. Later that day, they walked together to the fungal field. She didn't speak much, but she watched everything. The sprayers misting the dome, the rusted tools, the shifting sky. Her eyes were sharp, taking it all in. "There's a rhythm to it," Davin explained, adjusting a valve. "Each dome gets fed twice a day. If you skip even one cycle, the roots start dying." She crouched beside him, inspecting the growths. "Your people eat this?" He nodded. "There's protein in the flesh, not much taste, but it keeps us alive." She reached out, pressed a fingertip into the side of a bulb. The skin gave slightly, then rebounded. "It's not native," she murmured. "It smells wrong." He raised an eyebrow. "You can tell?" "My people used to grow food in caves. Similar methods, different smell." It was the first thing she'd shared about herself. He didn't push, just let it settle. When they returned to the shelter that evening, she went straight to the stove and began boiling water without waiting for instruction. Davin sat at the crate table, hands folded, watching her work. She moved differently now. Not like a prisoner waiting for command, but like a person reclaiming a piece of routine. As they ate, she looked up at him and said, "They took my name when I was captured. Called me thing, asset, unit. It's been a long time since someone said my name and meant it." Davin's throat tightened. "You're not a unit here," he said. She nodded, not as a reply, but as a marker of understanding. That night, when he laid out his bedroll, she shifted the cot slightly to one side, making space between them. No wall, No symbolic line, just proximity, just enough. And when they both lay down in silence, neither of them felt like strangers anymore. They weren't healed, they weren't safe, but they were real. And for now, that was enough. They walked through the colony together now, not beside each other like partners, but not apart either. A careful distance, the kind that left room for retreat, hers if she needed it, his if she demanded it. Lyria wore the boots Davin had traded for, her stride quieter now on the hard frosted walkways. Her steps had gained rhythm, but her eyes still searched, scanning corners, watching guards, noting cameras. It wasn't paranoia. It was habit, survival. They carried a container between them, filled with prepped protein spores for the processing depot. Just another errand, just another day. But Davin could feel it. Every gaze they passed, every sideways glance from men who remembered her shackles and couldn't quite accept her standing on her own feet now. They didn't spit yet, but the silence was heavy. Halfway to the depot, someone broke that silence. A low voice from behind. "Didn't think you liked your prizes walking upright, Trends." Davin stopped cold. The words didn't surprise him, but the timing cut deep. Lyria turned her head just enough to see. A stocky man leaned against the recycler tower, arms crossed, face split with a crooked grin. Not a guard, just a miner, but the kind who liked power wherever he could steal it. Davin turned. "Say that again," the man laughed. "Easy, no offense meant. Just surprised you're showing her off like that." Lyria stood still. She didn't cower, didn't move behind Davin, but he saw her hand curl into a fist at her side. "She's not a thing," Davin said. "Not a prize, not yours to comment on." Something in his voice must have changed, because the miner looked up, expression cooling. He didn't reply, just pushed off the wall and walked away. They finished the delivery in silence. Later, back at the shelter, Lyria stood by the door, her arms folded. She hadn't said a word since the exchange. Not during the walk, not during the unpacking. Davin filled the kettle and set it on the stove. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what he said." "I've heard worse," she replied. He turned to face her. "That's not the point." She looked at him. "Then what is?" He exhaled, sat on the crate beside the stove, arms resting on his knees. "The point is," he said slowly, "you shouldn't have to hear any of it." Her gaze softened, but only slightly. "You can't protect me from what people think," she said, "and I don't want you to." He tilted his head. "What do you want?" That stopped her. For a moment, her face flickered, hesitation, maybe fear. But it passed. "I want you to understand that I've survived worse things than insults, and that surviving doesn't mean forgetting." She walked to the far wall, crouched beside the basin, dipped her hands in cold water, and let silence stretch. Then, without turning, "My people were taken during the Lorthian expansion. Our systems were deemed low threat, low tech. We had no ships, no fleet. We didn't resist, not at first. We thought if we gave them what they wanted, they'd leave us alone." Her hands moved slowly through the water, washing away dirt that wasn't there. "I was 16. They loaded my village into transports. I don't remember the name of the first station, just that it smelled like burned oil and piss. They assigned numbers, burned them into clothing. The first time someone touched me without asking, I bit his hand. They beat me, broke 2 ribs. That's when I learned how to be quiet." Davin didn't interrupt. He didn't move. "They sold us like livestock, and eventually I stopped hoping someone would see me." She stood, dried her hands, turned to face him. "And then one day someone did." Her voice didn't shake. That unnerved him more than anything. "I should have helped sooner," he said. "Back at the admin center, I knew what they were doing. I saw the rotation schedules. I filed audits and looked the other way." She stepped closer. "But you didn't look away from me." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I had a sister," he said. "Before the collapse. She was part of a protest group on Mars. Pacifist. Thought she could shame the board into cutting ties with off-grid slave markets. They took her during a rally. She vanished. No records, no recovery. I filed complaints, pushed back, got blacklisted. They reassigned me here." She studied him, the silence between them stretching into something more than silence. It was understanding. Recognition. "Did you love her?" she asked. "She was the only person I didn't lie to," he said. And there it was. His truth. Lyria stepped to the cot, pulled the blanket around her shoulders, and sat down slowly. "I don't want saving," she said, "but I won't stop you if you want to stand with me." His reply came without hesitation. I'm already standing. That night, they didn't sleep far apart, not touching, not yet, but close. Close enough that when the wind moaned across the fields and shook the walls, they both stayed warm. The first time she laughed, it was because of a fungus rat. David had spent half the morning elbow-deep in slush, trying to pry a snapped coolant valve from the base of a mist regulator when he spotted it. Small, fast, and ugly as sin. It had slipped past the perimeter fences and somehow wedged itself under the spray pipe, twitching its tail like it owned the place. He threw a wrench, missed. The creature darted left, then right, then bolted straight into his boot. He jerked back, tripped over a rock, and landed on his side in a shallow puddle of half-frozen runoff. When he came limping back into the shelter, soaked through one sleeve and muttering under his breath, Lyria looked up from where she was mending a pair of gloves. Her eyes met his, dropped to his mud-covered arm, then back again. And she laughed, short, breathy, unguarded, like a sound she hadn't meant to make. He froze. She caught herself too late, biting down on the smile. But her eyes were still lit, still alive in a way he'd never seen before. He blinked, then grinned. Glad I could be useful. You looked like you were wrestling it, she said, the corners of her mouth still twitching. I was. She handed him a dry cloth. You lost. They didn't speak much for the next hour, but something had shifted again, this time without words. The air between them was lighter, not easy, but easier. David changed clothes, dried his boots by the stove, and sat across from her while she sewed. Her hands were deft, her focus steady. You've done that before, he said, watching the thread pull tight. My mother taught me, she replied. She used to mend everything, even when we didn't need it. What was she like? Lyria paused, needle hovering mid-stitch. She smelled like salt and clay, sang off key, and hated silence. David smiled gently. She'd hate it here then. She would have tried to plant something anyway, said soil listens to patience. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything at all. The next day, the cold snapped hard, the kind of cold that bit into metal and clung to skin like teeth. David ignored the sting. He always did. There were too many pipes to fix, too many cables exposed by frost heave. By mid-afternoon, his fingers had gone numb beneath his gloves, and the ice was setting into his shoulders. But he didn't stop. Not until the ground shifted beneath him. Not until the tools dropped from his hands, and the edges of his vision grayed. He staggered back to the shelter on autopilot, not remembering the walk. Lyria opened the door just as he reached it, pulled him inside before he could collapse. She didn't speak, just moved with frightening efficiency, dragging him to the cot, stripping off his soaked clothes, wrapping him in every blanket they had. His skin was white-blue, breath shallow. She lit the stove to full heat, boiled water, pulled down the emergency thermal pack from the supply shelf and wrapped it around his chest. He groaned once, tried to sit up. Don't move, she ordered. Her voice was low but firm, hands pressed flat to his skin, measuring for warmth. He managed. No, she said more sharply this time. You're not fine. The fever set in by nightfall. She kept the water boiling, bathed his forehead with cloths, spooned broth between his lips, even when he didn't respond. His eyes opened once, cloudy, unfocused, and he said her name like it belonged to someone else. Lyria, don't go. I'm here, she whispered. He didn't hear her. By the second night, he stopped shivering. She wasn't sure if that was good or bad. His breathing was shallow, pulse erratic. She sat by the cot, one hand resting lightly over his. I don't know how to do this, she said quietly. I know how to kill, how to endure, but I don't know how to wait. The shelter was quiet except for the soft hiss of the stove and the whisper of wind against the outer panels. She stayed awake. By the third day, the fever broke. When he stirred, coughing weakly, she was beside him with water. He drank barely, but his eyes focused for the first time in hours. You're back, she said, her voice barely above a breath. I left, he rasped. She smiled just a little. You weren't exactly good company. Sorry, don't be. He lay back, exhausted. You stayed. Of course. His hand shifted, found hers. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. I thought I was done, he murmured. You almost were. Silence settled between them, but this time it was full. Thank you, he whispered. You don't have to thank me, she said. You gave me a bed, a name. You didn't ask for anything. That's more than anyone's given me in years. He turned his head toward her. I didn't give you anything. I just stopped taking. She didn't correct him. That night, she slept beside the cot on the floor, her hands still wrapped around his. He didn't dream of cold that night. He dreamed of her voice, quiet and steady, calling him back to life. Davin woke to the sound of steady rhythmic scraping, metal against stone. He blinked, disoriented for half a second before he saw her, crouched near the stove, sharpening a salvaged knife along the edge of a broken alloy panel. Her movements were clean and unhurried, every pull of the blade purposeful. The fever was gone. His mind was clear, but the weight in his chest hadn't left. "Morning," he croaked. Lyria looked over her shoulder. "You're alive," she said flatly, but her voice held a softness it never used to. "You slept through 2 meals and a visit from the overseer." That woke him properly. "Van came here?" "Not Van. One of his men. Asked to confirm your audit logs. I told him you were unconscious." Davin sat up, head pounding. "What did he say?" He laughed, said you must be enjoying your prize too much to show up for duty. Davin's jaw clenched. "And you?" She held his gaze. "I said he's not enjoying anything. He's sick, and I'm not a prize." Silence. Then she added, quieter, "He didn't laugh after that." Davin slowly pushed the blanket aside and stood, legs weak but steady. Lyria rose too, watching him carefully as he moved toward the water basin. He washed his face in silence. "That was risky," he said, not unkindly. "So is breathing," she replied. The tension dissolved with that single line. He smiled despite himself. Later that afternoon, when Davin could stand without swaying, they walked together into the heart of the colony. It wasn't often they ventured that far in. The closer you got to the command dome, the thicker the surveillance got. The more uniformed men you saw, the more teeth behind the smiles. But they needed gear, new heating coils, sealant tape for the water line, and another thermal blanket. Davin hadn't thought to ask for permission, and Lyria hadn't asked to stay behind. The trading hall was busy, crowded with workers fresh off the mid-cycle shift. The recycled air buzzed with noise and filtered light. No one stopped to greet them, but heads turned. Conversations quieted. The presence of the alien woman walking beside Davin like an equal disrupted the social balance like a stone dropped in still water. Lyria didn't shrink. She walked beside him, chin level, eyes forward. Her steps were measured, not cautious but grounded, like someone who had reclaimed the right to take up space. At the requisitions counter, the clerk barely looked at the list Davin handed over. Instead, he let his eyes travel to Lyria and linger there. "Still bringing her around, huh?" he said. "Surprised you haven't traded up. Heard there's a new batch in from the outer moons." Davin didn't move, but his voice dropped to a low, dangerous calm. "Say that again." The man grinned. "I'm just saying, you look like the type who likes a little variety." Lyria stepped forward. "You speak too freely," she said. The man blinked. "Excuse me?" She moved closer, slowly, deliberately. "You think I won't remember you, that people like me don't keep track, but we do." His smugness faltered. "I didn't mean, you meant exactly what you said," she replied. "You see me and think of property. I see you and think of rot." The silence that followed was absolute. Davin stepped beside her, his presence quiet but immovable. "This is my wife," he said. "If you speak to her like that again, you won't be speaking to anyone." The clerk stared at them for a beat, face pale. Then he shoved the supplies across the counter without another word. They didn't speak again until they were outside, the wind sharp across the open compound. "Wife," she said, glancing at him sideways. Davin didn't look at her. "Felt right." She nodded once. It did. When they returned to the shelter, the quiet between them was different. It wasn't just survival anymore. It wasn't protection. It was something mutual, chosen. That night, after the repairs were done and the heat sealed tight inside the walls, Lyria stood over the cot for a long time. Then she turned to him. "I've shared this space. I've shared food, silence, and fire. But I haven't shared this," she said, touching her chest. He stepped forward slowly, not assuming. "You don't have to." She shook her head. "I want to." She took his hand and guided it to her heart. "You healed me," she said. "Not by trying, just by staying." They stood like that, together in the quiet warmth, until words no longer mattered. Davin stepped into the morning light with a fresh coil of synth rope slung over his shoulder. The sun on Greyline never truly rose. It just softened the haze into a livable glow, casting long, red-tinted shadows across the fungal fields. But today, For the first time in months, the cold felt bearable, even welcome. Behind him, the door to the shelter swung open with a quiet hiss. Lyria joined him, sleeves rolled past her elbows, hair bound back with a length of cloth she'd dyed herself using crushed moss pigment. It made her dark features even sharper, her expression steadier. She carried 2 mugs of broth and handed one to him without a word. They stood together in the silence, watching the misters pulse over the biodomes. The shelter had changed. Where once it had been a structure barely clinging to purpose, it was now a home. The outer walls were reinforced with heat moss padding and anchored with scavenged metal sheets. Inside, she had organized the storage crates by function: tools, food, medicine. There were shelves now, hooks for coats, plants suspended in converted air filters hung above the heater, catching moisture and scenting the space with something vaguely floral. The space reflected not just their survival, but their intention. She sipped her drink. The sprayer is clogging again, leftmost dome. He nodded. I'll check it after breakfast. You need gloves. Your hands crack more than the pipes. He looked down at the raw skin along his knuckles, then raised an eyebrow. Not everyone has perfect skin like yours. She tilted her head, mock serious. Mine's thicker. They both smiled quietly. By mid-morning, they were working side by side beneath the canopy. She patched a regulator line while he cleared the sprayer head. No words, just the kind of easy practice coordination that came from weeks of shared labor. At noon, a supply drone passed overhead, low, loud, casting its shadow like a blade across the field. They both paused to watch it. Lyria shaded her eyes. Haven't seen one that close in a while. Probably scouting, David muttered, checking if we're still alive. Maybe they're looking for reasons to take back what they gave. He looked at her. They never gave you. They just lost you. She didn't respond at first. Then softly, that part of me is gone now. The one who thought I'd be forgotten forever. You weren't. She reached over and placed a hand on his chest, palm flat over his heart. You made sure of that. That evening, David returned to the shelter first and lit the stove. Lyria came in shortly after, carrying a handful of winter root and the last of the filtered water. She pulled off her boots, dropped into a crouch beside the heater, and looked at him. I've been thinking. Dangerous, he said lightly. She ignored the tease. You don't have to keep calling me your wife just to protect me. He set the ladle down. I don't. Then why do you? He met her gaze across the warm silence. Because I want to. Lyria's expression didn't change, but her breathing did, just a little. Her shoulders eased. You know we're not like the others, she said. I know. No ceremony, no contract, not even a shared name. We don't need those things. What do we need? She asked, barely above a whisper. He stepped around the stove, knelt in front of her, and reached out. Not to take, but to offer. We need this. What we already have. Trust, fire, space to choose each other. Her hand found his again. I never thought I'd choose anyone again, she said, or be chosen. I never thought I'd matter to someone who saw everything. Her fingers tightened. Later that night, after the last embers in the stove faded to a steady glow, Lyria lay beside him, her head on his shoulder, her breath soft and even. You know, she murmured, when they brought me to you, I thought I'd been given to a man who wanted something. I did, he said. She stiffened slightly until he added, I wanted you to live. Silence again. Then, slowly, she smiled. Outside, the wind howled. But inside, the walls held. The warmth stayed. Morning came with a gentle red hue. Lyria stood by the door, watching the sky as it brightened in bands of rust and crimson. Davin joined her, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders. She leaned into him, eyes fixed on the horizon. I used to believe I was nothing, a thing, a unit, a silence. And now, he asked, she turned to him. Now I believe I'm someone. Because you didn't turn away. She touched his jaw. Because you saw me. He pulled her close, forehead resting against hers. My wife, he said. And for the first time, the word didn't feel like a shield. It felt like home. The day had been the warmest gray line had offered in months. The frost didn't bite that morning. The sky, usually a flat wash of rust and ash, stretched wide and open, painted in dusky lavender and soft reds that never fully gave way to blue. The fungal fields steamed gently under the midday light, their domes glistening with thawed mist. Davin and Lyria had worked quietly beside one another, hands moving in rhythm, Harvesting roots, cleaning filters, reinforcing the boundary line with scrap mesh Davin had scavenged the week before. Lyria had laughed again. Not at anything in particular, just at the way her fingers sank into soft earth, or how Davin tried to chase off a stubborn scavenger bird with a tool belt. Her laugh was different now, freer. Less like something escaping and more like something that had returned to her. By the time they closed the shelter door behind them that evening, the sky was dimming into its familiar twilight red. The heater hummed gently, and a faint smell of baked root and moss tea hung in the air. They didn't speak at first. Lyria pulled off her gloves and set them on the hook by the wall. Davin moved to the stove, stirred the pot, and tasted the broth out of habit. But she didn't join him at the table. She stood in the center of the shelter, still in her work clothes, worn thermal tunic, sleeves pushed up to her elbows, hair half loose from where she'd tied it back that morning. Her eyes found him, unwavering. He noticed the shift in her before she spoke. Her stillness, the way her fingers curled at her sides, the breath she took as though she were stepping out onto new ground. "I'm ready," she said softly. He turned to face her fully. "For what?" "To stay," she said. "Not just survive here, but to grow something, with you." She stepped toward him slowly, deliberate in a way that made his heartbeat rise. "You gave me back my voice. You never asked for my body. You never expected anything." She stopped a breath away from him. "But tonight, I want to give it to you. Because I choose this. Because I choose you." He didn't reach for her at first. He let the words settle, real, steady, heavier than anything he'd been given in years. "You're sure?" he asked. "I've never been more sure." When he cupped her face in both hands, it wasn't to claim, but to honor. His touch was careful, like she was sacred, like she wasn't his, but someone who had chosen to let him close. She leaned into it. Their first kiss was slow, not hesitant, but reverent. No hunger, just closeness. A breath shared between them after so long holding everything in. Davin's thumb traced the line of her jaw, memorizing the warmth of her skin. She slid her hands beneath his shirt, fingers gliding over old scars, the remnants of years he didn't talk about. He didn't flinch. He let her feel them all. They undressed each other like they were unwrapping something long forgotten. Not lustful, but intimate. Their movements were unhurried, each piece of clothing a layer between them, being shed not just from skin, but from history. When he laid her down on the cot, he didn't press or claim. He hovered above her, waiting for her hand to reach for him again. It did. They moved together like the wind did across the domes, slow, deliberate, with purpose but without violence. His breath caught when she arched into him, her body warm beneath his. She held his gaze through it all, never looking away, as though memorizing the way he looked in this moment. He whispered her name, Lyria, and she responded with his, breathless and soft, Davin, like they were grounding each other in reality. There was no rush, no single moment of climax or fireworks, just the quiet rising of connection between them, steady and whole. A rhythm made not for escape, but for arrival. And when they stilled, skin to skin beneath the blankets, she curled against his chest, her legs slung over his, her fingers tracing slow, invisible lines along his ribs. "I want to build something with you," she whispered. "A life, a garden, maybe more." His hand found hers beneath the covers. "Even here?" he asked. "Especially here," she said. "If something can grow in this place, it means it was real enough to survive anything." They lay like that for a long time, the silence no longer heavy, but full. Outside, the wind had died entirely, a rare thing, a good omen. Inside, two people lay tangled in warmth, choosing each other in a world that had tried to steal choice from them. And slowly, gently, without fanfare, something new began.